This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 168.
God, it's gonna sound so hokey, but see them and affirm them. Um and I don't mean like blindly that anything you do is great, because affirmation sometimes means checking those problematic behaviors. It means checking those unproductive behaviors, but truly seeing a kid and valuing who they are and what they bring and trying to find it. And I'm not going to lie, it's work sometimes. Like, some kids are like turtles in the shell.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action, because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Erman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with my first-time guest host, Mr. Anthony, the awesome AP Swan. Anthony,
Hello.
how'd it feel to be on the other side of the coin?
It feels good, man, to be able to be on a platform and share with you, another phenomenal educator. So I appreciate you for having me to co-host today.
Absolutely. I'm honored that you came back and you gave us some time to join our conversation. So tonight we had time to speak with Kimberly Jones, who is the North Carolina Teacher of the Year. What was one of your biggest takeaways or things that really struck you with our conversation tonight that you think will really impact our listeners?
The one thing, how she said that, when teachers are feeling burnt out or when they're struggling, what could you do to help power them up? And she said, thank you. And so many times teaching is a thankless profession, but those two words can go such a long way with someone who's not feeling appreciated, with teachers who feel burnt out. If you just turn around and say thank you, to let them know that I see you, I appreciate you for showing up every day, although you may not feel like it, but you're here. I think that it's imperative, especially for educators in a day and time like this, because of not feeling valued and how people are making decisions for us as educators that have never been educators, and that can be frustrating as well. So, just those two words is very powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, she brought so much insight into the way she conducts her classroom from a relationship and from I don't think we ever used the word management, but frankly, it was from a management standpoint in terms of the culture of her room, but also talks about how to teach really difficult topics in a high school classroom with grace and humility. And we ask her some tough pedagogy questions too. And she shares a lot about how she delivers instruction in her classroom, how she motivates her students, how she holds them accountable, and how she assesses them. And so I thought it was a well-versed conversation in showcasing her skill set and her expertise. So I think our listeners will definitely take a lot away from this conversation. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to jump right into that conversation with Kimberly Jones.
Absolutely.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Hi, Kim. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Excellent. I am really excited for this conversation. So please officially introduce yourself to our audience. Let us know where you are coming from and give us an idea of what your career in education has looked like.
Awesome. I am Kimberly Jones, the 2023 Burrows Welcome Fund North Carolina State Teacher of the Year. I am in my 18th year in public education. I'm a high school English teacher at Chapel Hill High School in the Chapel Hill Carver City Schools District in North Carolina. And for the majority of my teaching career, I've had a focus on sophomores I've taught a little bit of everything, but the one consistent has been world lit. That second year of high school, that's sort of where I found my vibe and where I connect. That's a focus on world literature. But in addition to that, I'm also a Holocaust and human rights educator. And I spend a significant part of my year helping other teachers learn and develop in teaching human rights, and doing so with like a culturally relevant lens in particular. And that's been a significant focus of a lot of my career, growing in my work as an equity based educator and helping other teachers to do the same. And that's been a large part of my work this year as the North Carolina Teacher of the Year, spreading that message of culturally relevant and responsive teaching and ways to make that applicable and meaningful for all students from all backgrounds and all regions of our state. And it's been really awesome.
So I really want to dig into everything that you just said, and the grin on Anthony's face is making me excited because this is Anthony's first shot at being my guest co-host, and I can already tell that this is the perfect pairing, which is just a coincidence. But I want to roll back to I'm gonna go year 2, not year 1. Year 1 is just pure survival mode for all teachers. Yeah. Year 2, year 3, year 4, what is something that you feel you developed as a core value of your classroom that has never left, is still a core value today in year 18 of your teaching that you feel has helped you become who you are as a teacher, and year 30, year 35 is still going to be a core value of your classroom?
That I'm going to create a space that I bring my authentic self into every day. And in doing that, foster a community where my kids feel safe to bring their authentic selves. They are, as I said, I've been teaching sophomores for 19 years, and these are children on the precipice of young adulthood. I think that's the thing I love about that age group. They are testing the world and themselves. I talk a lot about the really great thing I love about that age group is they have a BS meter that is unmatched. Like, real recognizes real. And one of the most authentic ways that I've found to build community is to be my full self and to not necessarily match their energy, but to treat them as the young adults that they're wanting to become and to hold them accountable to that. That I am going to offer them freedoms, but those freedoms come with responsibilities. I'm going to present them rigorous and challenging and meaningful and thoughtful things to read, to discuss, to respond to. But that's going to take a greater level of maturity on their part. And over these last almost 20 years, I have been beautifully surprised by the ways that kids will rise to that challenge. When you treat them as thoughtful young adults, they'll meet you there. But while giving them the grace of maturation that every kid deserves, like I talk about my kids. I tell their parents, like, our kids are cakes, and if you've ever baked and you put a cake in the oven and it's right on the verge of being done, but it's still shaky in the middle, you can ice it. You can let it cool down if you want to. You can, decorate it and it can look like a cake, but it's still raw in the middle. Don't let the icing fool you. For as much as they want to be treated like young adults and we want to give them those opportunities, giving them the grace of understanding that their brain is not fully formed yet. Even your best kid is going to have days where they struggle, where that prefrontal cortex is not firing the way it ought to, and giving the room for both of those things to be true. That you can have a really thoughtful, really intelligent kid who just freaks out one day because their friend said something, or they read a text message, or they saw something on Instagram. And knowing that every day is an opportunity for them to reset. But when they know that's the default in my class, they they rise to those expectations. Like I offer them grace, they offer me grace, and it it truly becomes a learning community. And I think if you talk to any kid I've taught across these 19 years, that's one thing they would say, that Miss Jones might have been hard. The work might have been challenging, but there was never a doubt that she cared about who I was as a person. And at the end of the day, she wanted me to learn and she wanted me to be better. And she was going to do as much as possible to help me make that happen. As long as I was putting in the work, she was going to put in the work too. And that's something that I figured out probably in year 2 or 3. I didn't have, I didn't have the luxury of maturity on my part. We were basically the same age. And so I had to acknowledge that. Like I had to acknowledge what I knew and what I didn't know. Um, and I think they appreciated that because they saw me putting in the work to be better. Like I don't have 10 years of experience, y'all. This is brand new, but I'm going home every night putting in the work to be better for y'all the next day. You darn sure need to put in an equal measure of work for yourself. And having those conversations, I think, rather frankly and directly with kids, they respected. And that really hasn't changed, even though I do have maturity on my side now. We're in different phases of life. And, when I used to be an older sister, now I'm an auntie, and I own that too. There's a beauty in that change and phase of who I am to my kids, but the authenticity of the relationship has remained the same.
Anthony, I know you're chomping at the bit
Yeah,
here.
I just want to speak to that. Like you speak to my heart to hear you say this. I'm an elementary educator, and believe it or not, elementary children have the same BS radar. They
Mm-hmm.
know when teachers care and they know when teachers don't care, and so they kind of
Absolutely.
it's it just to hear a high school teacher say the same exact thing, because I've talked with many educators across this nation, and some of them are like, oh my god, I could never do high school. And I always say, why not? They're children just like elementary kids are. They're just a little bit older. They're still children. um, but if you build that relationship with them and connect with them, once they love you, they'll do anything for you. They'll try their best on every
Absolutely.
exam. They'll try their best to make sure that they don't disappoint you. And so to be able to hear you saying what you're saying and how it has resounded throughout the 19 years that you've been in the classroom as a high school educator, it just makes my heart smile, because it lets me know that I am doing the right thing by connecting and making those connections with those students, and being on their level, and sometimes even talking their language. And you don't always have to be as professional to connect with them. Like, instead of, sometimes I may look at some of my kids and it's like, no cap, and they'll look at me like, how do how do you know that? How do you know what? Like, it catches them off guard, but at the same time, it it lets them know that I'm human too. I think it's important that we are honest with our students too, by letting them know that we make mistakes and we don't always, do the right thing. I remember walking in the classroom a couple of weeks ago, and I'm an assistant principal now, but the teacher had called for some support, and I walked in the room and I was already frustrated, and I had raised my voice at one of the fifth graders, and he looked kind of surprised, and I immediately stopped and I said, "I'm sorry. I was frustrated. I shouldn't have did that." But then when I apologized, the whole class looked like, "Wait, what?" So just making sure that students know that you're human too, it's a great piece. So kudos to you.
Thank you, sir.
So the idea of teaching these difficult topics,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned about Holocaust and being
Mm-hmm.
culturally relevant. Could you just go in a little
Mm-hmm.
bit more detail of what that looks like? Is it embedded into one of your classes? Is it a separate class? Like, what does that dynamic look like?
Yeah, Absolutely. So North Carolina actually has a law, the Gisela Abramson Holocaust Education Law, requiring Holocaust education to be taught either within English or within history or as an elective of its own, but it's a required part of the 612 curriculum. Within my school district, again, Holocaust education has always been a foundation of world literature. And I realized pretty early on that the first couple of times, as you said, those first few years, you're just keeping your head above water. And I realized that I was teaching a memoir as though it were a novel, that this is a story of someone and things that happen. And here's a little context. And probably in year 3, maybe, I think maybe I was in a different place in my life. I think I was seeing the world slightly differently, that ability to grow and mature as an adult. I realized that I was telling the story of a person and a people, particularly as a Black woman. I began to think about how the stories of my people and my culture had been taught, with what sensitivities and with what specificities. I remembered the teachers who did it well, and I remember the teachers who did it poorly. And I thought to myself, if I want, a white woman in rural North Carolina teaching the atrocities of American chattel slavery and Jim Crow racial oppression with thoughtfulness and with responsibility in a way that humanizes and empowers my students, I have to model that. And I thought, what better way to be the change I want to see than to devote myself to teaching this required piece of my curriculum with more aplomb, with more skill, with more expertise. And so I devoted myself to learning about the best and most responsible pedagogy around something, around such a sensitive topic. And the incredible thing is, when you dive into Holocaust and human rights education, while no systems of or experiences of oppression are identical, the systems at play within them are very similar. And the skills that I gained as a Holocaust educator made me a human rights educator. And it gave me the skills to more responsibly teach other difficult histories and other difficult events and occurrences within society. And so many of the guidelines that I use as a Holocaust educator, specifically taking my students safely in and safely out of the topic, I began to apply to everything that I taught. And it also gave me a set of skills to feel more confident in bringing in contemporary issues that were perhaps, more delicate or more complex that I know my students were experiencing in the world. And I knew they needed the safety of a structured place to begin considering those things. And again, I think any skill that you develop, you get more comfortable doing it, and you start to, the same thing we tell our kids, your education is a matrix. The things you learn in history should influence how you read a book. The things you learn in math class should help you be a better science student. The things you learn in your art classes should help you be a better musician, et cetera, et cetera. I found the same thing as a teacher. In devoting myself to being a responsible Holocaust educator, I just became a far more responsible educator at large. The sensitivities that I needed to have in teaching this particular piece of history and the literature that surrounded it made me more empathetic, more thoughtful, more responsive. It grew my social emotional awareness for all of my students in everything that we encounter. And it just helped me grow in phenomenal ways. Like, I know that the teacher I am today is so influenced by the fact that I devoted myself to that particular lane of pedagogy and skill so early in my career. And now it's just part and parcel of how I do everything. The guidelines that I use in teaching human rights are my general guidelines, and they ground my philosophy as an educator across the board.
Something you said that uh, struck with me was about mentioning bringing your kids safely in and safely out of the content. And it triggered a memory for me. When I was in college, I was an RA. In my first year, we were going through training, and one of them was dealing with students who were in crisis. And either experienced RAs or RDs, who are the directors of us, would act out scenarios. And I remember I was in a scenario where the person was acting as they were suicidal. And I asked the person, are you thinking about taking your own life? Like, in this 15-minute conversation of trying to de-escalate them. And I remember thinking in the moment, like, oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. And then afterwards, they would reflect and talk about what was done well, what wasn't done well, how it could have been approached differently. And it was probably like a counselor or a psychologist that was there leading it for us. She actually said one of the best things you did was ask her, was she thinking about taking her life? Because
Absolutely.
you're not going to, and she explained, you're not going to put the idea in their head. Like, those ideas may already exist, or it might confirm, like, no, those ideas are not in their head. You're not going to give them the idea. And it really has always stuck with me when working with teachers or students about, not necessarily in that same type of crisis mindset, but just this idea of, you don't necessarily have to dance around the topic of what might feel uncomfortable. And so I would love for you to explain a little bit more of what going safely in and safely out of a content like Holocaust looks like.
Absolutely. So one of the big things I'll say, number one, I love that you use that example, because one of the things that I have used part of my sabbatical this year to lean into is youth mental health first aid. And one of the guidelines of that youth mental health first aid training is that very fact, that when we see students in crisis, we can't get them help if we don't name the thing. And I think if we've gotten to the point that we are having to react to a child in crisis, that's clear. Like, we needed to assess where a kid is. If you're at that point, that's a different level of help, and that's going to trigger different responses. So I'm so glad you use that reference. But to your question, one of the very first things I think that's important anytime we're teaching something like the Holocaust or another human rights issue is to contextualize the fact that this is an event that happened to a group of people who had a culture and a life before this event. And it's important to start any exploration of what happened to a people with who they were before this thing happened. That they were people with agency and freedom and joy and full lives, that they are neither defined or wholly limited to this traumatic thing that happened to them. And so I start my kids with looking at Jewish life and culture in 20th century Europe. What was it like? Where were Jews living? How were they a part of society writ large? What were their contributions? How, what percentage of the population did they make up? How long had they been there? What do we understand about Judaism as a culture, as a faith, etc.? Grounding my kids holistically in who these people are, because if I understand and see your humanity, appreciate it, value it, I'm all the more moved and shaken and hopefully changed by the better when I see action that comes in that targets that attempts to eliminate that. I understand the sense of loss. If we start with, there's a piece that I taught for many years. I still do. Chimamanda Adichie's The Danger of a Single Story. And she talks about the danger of a single story being that there's no context. If you start with the arrows of the Native Americans and you don't start with the disease blankets or the guns of the settlers, that's a very different story. If I start at ghettos and camps as what defines Jewish people and culture and the Holocaust, my kids don't have a full understanding of what was lost and what was targeted and who these people were and how this truly was a crime against humanity, because I haven't introduced them to people's humanity. If all I start with is the triangle slave trade and not the greatness of West Africa and the African kingdoms that existed before European explorers come in, all my students understand about African American culture is it's grounded in oppression, that you were slaves and eventually a white man freed you. I think it's really critical for kids to safely enter a thing, to enter from a more humanistic way where we see and celebrate people, and that the Holocaust study doesn't end with, and then we dropped a bomb and camps were liberated and people just went back to life, or this many people were dead. We don't end with 6 million people dead. We talk about people reclaiming their lives. We talk about marriages in DP camps. We talk about like insane birth rates as people reclaim their lives. We talk about the Nuremberg trials and a quest for justice. We talk about the creation of Israel. We talk about immigration to the US. We talk about people moving on from this traumatic thing to reclaim their humanity. If you stop at oppression, the oppressor wins. And that's not what I want my kids to take away from what happened. That yes, there were these horrible actions, these horrible things were done. How do we track how those things developed? How a society of thinkers and philosophers ended up under this fascist control in a place where this kind of systemic genocide could occur. That's critical. But if we don't see people's humanity, there's nothing to stop it from happening again. If we don't fully understand, and I apply that to everything, I apply that to every culture. Even though my kids joke, I tell them at the beginning of the year, a lot of what you read in sophomore year in high school is very depressing. It's rather dark. There's not a lot of happy, but I even as we read about some of the darkest moments in human civilization or some of the darkest tendencies that people can have, I always want to balance that out with the possibility of better that lives in every person, that at no point the safely in and safely out, I think is best kind of summed up in the fact that none of these things were inevitable. One of the grounding principles of teaching the Holocaust, or I think any human rights crisis, is at no point, despite what historical context might create or the sense that historians try to make of it, there was nothing that is inevitable. Human beings always have choice. We always have capability and agency. And particularly for teenagers, I think it's critical for them to know, in a world where they feel like their voices aren't listened to, that they don't have as much power as their adult peers. I think it's critical for them to know that we always have choice, we always have agency. And that starts today with how you treat the person across the room, how you treat the person in the cafeteria, how you treat somebody online. You do have power, you do have agency, and there's always an alternative to, oppression and murder and violence. There's always there's always an alternative.
So I would just like to, just kind of ask you some questions about how do you deal with or make students feel safe that may feel
Mm-hmm.
like um, you're moving on to the critical race theory,
Mm-hmm.
making students feel, or how do you ensure parents that that is not your intent um, of the curriculum that you teach? How do you do that?
If number one, that's never my intention. My that's never my intention. If at any point any of my children, any of my students, including myself, feel conviction, it's the conviction of our humanity, not our culture or ethnicity. Because these actions are human actions. Like, yes, they may be perpetrated by one group of people against another group of people at a given time, but we've got enough oppression like, there's no Olympics of oppression. We got enough isms in the world, ableism, sexism, there's enough obias in the world that everybody's been on the receiving end of that treatment. We are convicting poor choices by humanity.
I
We're
love it.
convicting poor choices by humanity. And every single one of us has the opportunity to be a perpetuator of peace and justice and equality and freedom and agency and respect and affirmation of others, or we have the ability to be perpetuators of oppression and subjugation and inequity. That lives within all of us. That is a human capability. Yes, it has been carried out by governments, by specific groups of people at given times, but there's not a continent we can look at, maybe with the exception of Antarctica, where it hadn't happened. From people that look like each other to people who look like them to people who don't look like us to people who look like us. Like the point of conviction is not the skin we wear. The point of conviction is our souls and our brains and the choices we allow ourselves to make using those things. And so if my kids feel any sense of conviction, I want it to be a human conviction that as people, as sentient people with capability, with choice, with agency, with talent, we can all choose to be better.
I think that is such a great answer. And a lot of times, when teachers are teaching culturally relevant lessons, and they may be feeling uneasy, or sometimes their students are feeling uneasy, not realizing that in order for anyone to grow, you have to be uncomfortable. That's the only way you can grow in any type of situation. You have to feel uncomfortable. You have to feel those the sense of conviction, like you said. And so for you to be able to bridge that gap with your students and with your parents so that they can feel safe with the curriculum, I think that is just awesome.
Yeah, and that's and I certainly don't want it to be misconstrued. We don't spend our gear like woe is me in the doldrums and the depths of depravity of humanity. We also celebrate joy. When I talk about contextualizing a culture for every instance of racialized oppression, we talk about Black joy. We talk about Latino excellence. We talk about Native American achievement. We talk about Jewish resilience. We talk about Asian exceptionalism. We talk about all aspects of a culture so we understand that even as human beings, we are not, and the thing I want my kids to understand, you are not who you do not have to remain who you were on your worst day. Like, if I help my kids to know nothing else, it's you do not have to remain who you were on your worst day.
Yes, that is
Like,
so.
every day
I'm using
is
that
a
one.
chance to get better. Yeah, no, like, I hope they give me that grace, like that the day that Miss Jones annoyed you or pissed you off or were short with you, that's not who you leave me as. That you give me the opportunity to be better, to make amends, to apologize, to make it right. And I think that's critical for kids, especially with the social and emotional and mental health issues, Ken, that you kind of alluded to, but certainly that we're seeing more and more amongst our young people. Like, I never, ever, ever want my kids to go home and make a permanent decision about a temporary set of circumstances. I need them to know that there is tomorrow and there's a capability for tomorrow to be better. Either that you're going to move on from this place and these people, or that you can be better tomorrow. And they're young and they don't know that because their brains haven't fully developed. I have to be the one to intentionally inject. We can be better. We can do better. You know, to your point, Anthony. That's when I have to go to my kids' culture and quote them a little bit. It's like the Glorilla song. That's why I love tomorrow. That's why I love tomorrow. Like, there's always a chance for it to be better. Like, I don't necessarily play that full song for other reasons, but like when I make the reference my high school kids, I mean, I know they listen to it, but that's the beauty of tomorrow.
So I know that it might be difficult for you to relate to this question because every student that you have in your class is electing to choose 10th grade English. They're extremely interested in world literature and all the topics that you teach, unlike
I see what you did there, Kim.
unlike the woodshop class where they're forced to take that
I
and
see what you did
have
there.
no interest in that. So when you're digging into this content, you speak a lot about how you're relating it to them, and I can see from that standpoint of how you're approaching it with students, you're going to make it more interesting for them. But what are some strategies you use to motivate your students to read, motivate your students to write, motivate your students to find the value in doing those practices and improving those practices? What are some of those things that you're doing in your classroom?
So, in as much as I talk a lot about the content of what I teach, the specific units and books that I choose, my classroom is skills driven. And it's one of the things I love about English. It's why I'm a humanities teacher. And I'm sure a math or a science teacher could do it. But that's why I'm not a math or science teacher, because I can't argue that case as well. But there is literally nothing that I ask my students to do in my class that they're not gonna have to do in the world. The ability to read and to comprehend written text is a life skill. It's an ability, and the absence of it is a profound disability, especially in a world where technology is growing as fast as it can. There is no replacement for comprehension. There's no replacement for the skill of analyzing an argument. Whether or not you can create one on your own, the ability to analyze whether it's game that a man or a woman or a potential partner is spitting at you, if it's what a potential political leader is saying, if it's what the commercial on TV is saying, the ability to analyze an argument and understand, what are these people trying to get out of me? What do they want from me? What are they trying to persuade me to do? And is it logical and sound and evidence based? You're going to need that. I don't care who you are. You may not recognize that's what you're doing, but it's what you're doing. The ability to communicate effectively, whether or not you feel comfortable doing it. And I know a lot of our kids struggle with that interpersonal connection and communicating effectively with each other, but it's still a skill you need. If you're talking to your friend, if you're talking to a boss, if you're talking again to a potential partner, the ability to communicate effectively is necessary. The ability to listen and to comprehend well is necessary. I find fiction to be a much needed uh, facet of life. If we can't escape into worlds that don't exist, my God help us. Like, if all we did was look at the literal, we would be some depressed people. And so whether or not it's a TV show or a book or a comic or a graphic novel, or a piece of writing that you create for yourself, both fiction and nonfiction text are a part of life. If it's lyrics in a song, if it's a movie that started off as a script that somebody came up with and wrote. Fiction and nonfiction text, informational text, speaking and listening, the ability to analyze arguments, the ability to research, like, here's something I don't know that I need to know, the ability to vet sources. That's the connection I make to those kids who are reluctant. And then, again, because they are young adults, I asked them, I was like, sweetheart, if you have found a path to success that does not include reading and writing, please tell Miss Jones. We can have a conference today at lunch. If you have found a life plan that does not include a high school diploma, let me know what it is. And if it's valid, I'll be the first one to walk you over to counseling and help you get started on that path. In 19 years of teaching, I've yet to meet a kid who can. That's the justification for what we do in here every day. That there's no path to success that is legal and productive that doesn't include these skills. And if you come up with one, let me know. That's a bet I haven't lost in 19 years. And I tell them that. I'm like, I'll bet you $20 you can't tell me a path that don't include your ability to use these skills. Give me one. That's a bet I haven't lost in 19 years. And sometimes that's just what I have to play, even if it's compliance for the sake of freedom. Mm-hmm. Like, there's some kids that I'm like, I know this is not where you want to be or what you want to do. The cost of freedom is successfully navigating the system. It doesn't have to be with an A. It's not going to be with an F. So let's get you through this. You show up, you give me, the modicum of work, of attention, of focus, and the high degree of respect that I'm going to give you and I require in this classroom. We're going to be good all day. You do not have to love this class to do well in it. I love it enough for both of us.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's so good, though, that you relate what you do to real life of how, because a lot of times you'll hear students say, what do we have to learn this for? I'm not going to use this when I get older, or just things like that. And just to be able to help them to see that every skill you're learning, you will use it one time or another in your lifetime. I think that it's imperative that children see that, to see the importance of a um, good, well-rounded, high-quality education. So,
And I think there's something to be said for the fact that no, you may not use it, but the people creating your world and creating the systems that you're going to have to operate in, they darn sure are.
yes, yes.
Like you're either going to be on the end of controlling and setting those parameters or being subject to them, but you're not going to escape them. It's just not going to happen. Like that's not how our world works. So you can either be empowered or you can be unempowered. Which one are
Mm,
you choosing to do? But baby, you're not going to escape people that can read and write and use language well. You're either going to be one of those people or you're not.
so
And
good.
I want you to be one of those people.
Yes.
How are you assessing success in your classroom related to those skills, and in a way that holds true to the content, holds true to the skills, and also holds true to like those core values that you just shared about why they're learning it?
Absolutely. Number one, there's the hard data. There's growth. Where my kids come in their Lexile, in their comprehension, in those formative and summative assessments, in that quantitative data, I want to see growth in every child. That's the number one measure. I tell beginning teachers all the time, um, it's hard. It's hard because those first few years you're just learning what you're doing. I'm not going to even tax you with growing every child. Just don't send them out worse than you found them. If all you can do is maintain, work to maintain. As a veteran educator, maintenance is not enough. Like my standard for whether or not I've been effective is, have these kids grown? Have they reached proficiency? That's my absolute goal. Is that going to happen every year? No, because sometimes we're dealing with 2 or 3 grade levels of struggle, or a kid who might be on a 6th grade level when I get them in 10th grade. If I can grow them from 6 to 8 in a school year, I'm going to call that a win. Is it proficiency as measured by the state? No. But can I see quantifiable growth in that child? Absolutely. Number two, their confidence in my class. And that's more of a qualitative measure. But if I have gone from a kid who was reluctant to engage, reluctant to read, reluctant to share out their own thoughts, to a kid that by third and fourth quarter is raising their hand to tell me what they think, to make those predictions, to make claims, to offer inferences, I'm going to absolutely call that a win. That is a hard measure of success in what I'm doing, because we do not take risks in places where we don't either feel safety or confidence. And if I can create a classroom where either one of those exists for my kids, I'm calling that a win. Where you feel safe in sharing your thoughts and taking that risk, I think, Anthony, that you talked about, stepping into that uncertainty of I might not be right, but understanding one of the things that I talk about a lot in my classroom is voice. That there is one you with your one unique set of traits and experiences, and nobody can out you. Nobody can be a more authentic you or a better you than you. And that inherently adds something to this learning community that nobody else can give. Like, you inherently are going to add something to this conversation because nobody's had your life experiences. I talk a lot about trying to create lessons that have low floors and high ceilings. And by that, I mean that the entry, the academic, the emotional, the personal entry is low enough that any student that's able to express themselves either in writing or by speech is able to offer input into the conversation. And that input is going to shape what I do and what the conversation looks like in the rest of class. So, if we're starting off when I start off the Holocaust unit, I don't start, even though I talk about culture, I don't start with, let's dive into Judaism as a faith, because some of my kids have no faith background. Like that whole premise is foreign to them and doesn't feel safe. But I ask them, I'm like, tell me about a time where you were not believed. Tell me about a time where you wanted to convince someone of something, your parents or a friend, and they did not believe your truth. How did that feel? What was that like? That is an experience that every human being that's engaged with somebody else has experienced. If it's a friend or a parent or a brother or sister, we've all had someone where we're like, no, I'm telling you the truth. And like, I just don't believe that. And I use that as a starting point that every kid in my room can assess, no matter their language level or their academic level, and we extend that to what does it mean when the truth no longer matters, when the government establishes a truth that's not real, when the government begins to create realities of like who are people and who's a person and who's not a person. We start from the very personal, and we're able to grow it to these high thinking skills. So those kinds of lessons allow my kids, like I said, to find their voice, to know their voice is important, to feel confidence to take those academic risks. And if they're willing to do that as the teacher, I feel like I can do the heavy work of growing them in the skills. So that's what success looks like for me, a place where all of those things are kind of happening.
I love the fact that you hone in on student voice. There are some veteran educators who are strict educators, as this is my way or the highway. I remember having a seventh grade teacher, and she said, this is not Burger King. You can't have it your way. It's my way or no way. And a lot of teaching and education has changed, whereas before educators were doing a lot of lecturing. Now the collaboration and the creativity of students is more prevalent in classrooms, whereas if the teacher's doing all the talking, then some learning is not happening, because sometimes students learn best from each other rather than from the teacher. And so being able to utilize student voice to help them with their learning and to affirm their learning, I think that is, I see why you are the 2024 North Carolina State Teacher of the Year.
Thank you.
Definitely. So I honestly could talk to you all night, Kim.
Yeah.
But I want to be cognizant of everyone's time, including our listeners. I think there's so much value you've brought to this conversation and so much depth in your answers. But I want to jump into our exit ticket, which are these same 4 questions that we ask every guest every week. And so I'm going to kick it off with question number 1. And then Anthony, if you are pulling up our sheet, you'll have question 2 and 3 right after me. Question number 1, what is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
God, it's going to sound so hokey, but see them and affirm them. And I don't mean like blindly that anything you do is great, because affirmation sometimes means checking those problematic behaviors. It means checking those unproductive behaviors, but truly seeing a kid and valuing who they are and what they bring and trying to find it. And I'm not going to lie, it's work sometimes. Like some kids are like turtles in the shell, and it takes 179 out of 180 days to get a breakthrough. But to let them know that you see them on those days when when they're not there. There's a lot of our students who live experiences where they are not missed. Like for a kid to hear I missed you in class, especially a kid that is not necessarily the most engaged, makes them go, hold on, but I don't even talk in here. What do you mean? You're like, no, I just miss you. It was weird. This side of the room was empty. I didn't like it. I'm glad you're back today. Those are the kinds of things that begin to chip away at that shell. And I think it's really critical. I think letting kids know that you see them. That doesn't mean that you're your best friend. That doesn't mean that you know the ins and outs of their lives, but that you see them and you're glad they're on your roster. You're glad that they're in your classroom. I think that goes a long way to getting them to take those academic risks that we need them to take to engage. It's one of those very real places that build rapport, and sometimes that's all you got. Like, no, because I was making groups and my group number was off because you were not here. So I'm glad you were back today so that class can work the way it's supposed to. And the kid's like, oh, okay. But that day, they're a little more engaged. They're a little more like, oh, she sees me. She knows I was here. She wondered where I was. Or he likes that I'm in his room. I think that goes a long way.
That's so awesome. So, what is the best advice you ever received from a colleague, a principal, or a student?
Oh, that's good. That's a really good question. I received some advice probably year 5 or 6 when I felt like I knew what I was doing, and I decided like, oh, I'm gonna coach, and I'm gonna sponsor this, and I'm gonna be in this thing and that thing and blah 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 blah. And one of my mentors told me, you cannot pour from an empty cup. You cannot be, no matter how much you try, you cannot be everything this child needs. Like, you can't change every child's challenging home situation. You can't address every social emotional need they have. What you can be is a consistent, responsible adult who shows up every day and does their job. And for some kids, that is a game changer. Like, there's a responsible adult who shows up at work every day. There's a responsible adult who gives me back my paper, who knows where things are. In this room, the pencils are always in the pencil cup. And this is the only place in my life where there is system and there is order, even if that order is accountability of like, Ken, where's your tardy note? Yes, there are times and occasions where Ken's not going to have his note and you pull me to the side and you tell me why, and I understand. But the default is, Ken, where's your note? Because that is how class works. That is how life works. That Miss Jones, I got 3 days to get this thing to her. I have to email her before 9:00. Yes, there's understanding for life challenges, but sometimes kids just need that consistency, and you cannot be everything. So you have to understand what's within your realm of control and what's not. And to make sure that you are investing in yourself, that you're getting sleep, that you know when to leave, like, okay, I did a wrestling match on Tuesday. I'm not going to be at this basketball game on Thursday. I was at a football game on Friday. I can't be at color guard on Saturday. There are 120 some people on this staff. Somebody else is going to show up for these kids. I need to go lay on my couch and watch Forensic Files. Like, I need to go, hang out with my family, because I can't, again, you can't pour from an empty cup. You got to take care of yourself so that you can care about anybody else, much less, 50 to 100 to 25 kids at a time.
I just want to highlight one thing you said too about being consistent. And I think that's overlooked at times. You can
Absolutely.
be, I could be very strict. Kim, you could be very, very not strict. And Anthony could be somewhere in the middle. And if kids go to all 3 of our classes, that's okay, as long as I don't move my line and you don't move yours.
Absolutely,
it's when the goalpost shifts that kids get frustrated, right?
Absolutely.
You need to set those expectations as a teacher, and you need to hold them. And you can be, if being organized and being strict is important to you, and that's part of who you are, kids will respect that. There's a teacher
Absolutely.
I can think of at our high school that he starts teaching he is speaking as the bell is ringing. And you know what? Kids are in his class on time every single day. And it's not a problem, because it's consistent, and that's what they need.
And I think great to your point, I think great administrators understand that.
Mm-hmm.
I think teachers are their best when they have administrators who understand that exact point. That what works in Mr. Ken's room versus what works in Miss Kim's room versus what works in Mr. Anthony's room is allowed to be different as long as we remain consistent. Kids have multiple modes of understanding. They understand that all their friends aren't the same. They can understand that all their teachers aren't the same. And that's part of their learning and growing, that in this space, this is who I need to be, and this is how I need to engage. But I think a big part of that being allowed to happen is relying on administrators who understand that truth.
I could not agree more. Like, I'm just over here just trying to hold my excitement because it's like we're connected.
Anthony.
I just told a teacher that today from an administrator role. Like, she's a first year teacher, and I said, you can't pour from an empty cup. I literally told her that today. So,
that's
and I love forensic files. So when you said all that, just
that's what's up.
Yeah. So you kind of hit on this a little bit, but we know that the school year, it goes in waves, and there are those days or weeks that we struggle to survive as educators. What is something that every educator needs to hear to power up in that moment of struggle?
Thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for showing up. Because for as challenging as this job is, there ain't a whole lot of people signing up to do it. And it's still, I believe, the most important thing that our society can do to invest in education for the present and the future. You have to know that you're valued. You have to know that you're appreciated. And I end every speech with saying thank you to my colleagues. Like, there ain't a whole lot of people signing up to do this. We're seeing some really significant attrition rates. Our colleges of eds aren't abounding with young people wanting to dedicate their lives to that, which is why beginning teacher support is so critical. Like, understanding, even though I'm in year 20, that kid in year 2, I was that kid at one point. Like, I gotta remember that and offer grace. Offer grace to each other, offer grace to yourself, and to hear thank you from a kid, from a colleague, from a parent. Like, some days that's what gets you through. Like, I think it's important. Like, yes, there's intrinsic motivation. We know what brought us to the classroom. We know our why, but why ain't always enough. Like, why has to be met with someone else seeing it. Like, we all need and deserve validation and affirmation for our success and for our attempts.
I am crying now because this is my second year as an administrator, and something that I pride myself on is that I'm in classrooms every single day. And last year, I had a 30-year teacher, a 30-year veteran teacher, and my thing is I go around to my teachers and I say, thank you for showing up today. How are you doing? Good morning. And she stopped me and she said, Mr. Swan, out of my 30 years of teaching, I've never had a principal to come to me every single day. And she said, I know it's genuine because you do it every day. Like, you make it your point. And I think I have a soft spot for teachers because it was a teacher who saved my life. And so I'm like, I want to be there. I want to be in the classrooms with the teachers. I want them to know that they have an administrator who values them and who's willing to say, okay, you need help with small groups? Okay, let me get in here and work with these. I think that, so for you to say that, it is so imperative because teaching is a thankless profession. And so to be able to tell a teacher, just thank you, and they say, for what? For just being you. That means so much. So
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. It's easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What separates the teachers who are the ones constantly seeking to change, innovate, and adopt new teaching strategies?
I think it goes back to something I mentioned earlier. When you see the actual kids in front of you, because they are never the same. That group of kids in front of you is never the same. So you can't, in good conscience or good practice, do the same thing. If my doctor came in and ignored everything on my chart and said, "Well, you're a 40-year-old Black woman. Here are the pills that most of your people need. So take these. Here are the interventions that most middle-aged Black women need. So do these things, irrespective of my actual numbers, my blood type, my levels." Like, we would call that bad practice. I can't, as a classroom teacher, just show up and give authentic groups of kids the same old, same old. Like, it's not pertinent. It's not meeting their needs. Like, yes, there are best practices. Yes, no matter, my doctor's going to come in and tell everybody you need to exercise, you need to get enough water, you need to get enough sleep. That's because you're human. There are baseline things that as a classroom teacher we're going to do because they're best practice and they're the core of our curriculum. But to your point about change, I think change is driven authentically when we see who is sitting in our classrooms and we see them authentically. You have to change because the kids aren't the same by generation, by trait, by skill. I think the pandemic, and I hate when the pandemic comes up because it's such a catch-all for so many things in education conversations. But I think it did show us that in a way that it shook the table in a way that it had not had to be shaken, because these kids, these young people truly are different. Like, their neurology was changed by that experience. And I think we have to be responsive to that. But pandemic notwithstanding, kids are different every year. And I think when you're thoughtful and in actual communication with who's in your room, your teaching is going to change and improve to meet those needs.
So awesome. Well, Miss Jones, we definitely thank you. So how can our audience connect with you in the future?
Absolutely. I am at Kim Jones Teaches on Instagram and kimjonesteaches.com online, and Kim Jones Teaches at gmail.com. And folks can reach out to me in any of those ways and follow me on any of those socials. I'm also on Twitter at Kim Jones Teaches.
Kim, this conversation really has been fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kim.
I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and there's been so many great conversations on this show, and what I've come to appreciate is there's so many commonalities in what we hear, but there's so much personal touch to everything that you say, and the approach that you take with your students in your content in your area of the country with your backgrounds. It just makes everything different and special for what we can do in our classroom. So thank you again. We'll link to everything you just shared in terms of your socials and the ways to contact you in our show notes, which you can find wherever you're watching or listening to the show. And if you have not already, we would please appreciate you subscribing to our podcast and listening to more great conversations that we have with educators from across the country. So Kim, thank you again. And Anthony, why don't you take us on out here?
Yes, thank you all so much for listening to our Powered Up podcast tonight with Ms. Kimberly Jones, the 2024 North Carolina State Teacher of the Year. We hope that something was said to affirm who you are, especially to our listeners. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week, we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.